Tywin Lannister stood upon the highest balcony of Casterly Rock, the chill of early dawn clinging to the stones, the wind from the sea carrying faint brine up the steep cliff face. Though the fortress had long been his home, it felt different this morning. In place of the usual iron sense of purpose that pervaded the seat of House Lannister, there was a faint but growing hope. And for a man who had long walked the corridors of power with stern resolve, that hope was as disquieting as it was invigorating. He tightened his black velvet cloak around his broad shoulders, mindful of the stony parapet that had known the footsteps of Lannisters for centuries. Below him, the crashing of waves resonated, a constant, relentless percussion against the pillars that held the castle aloft. Over the years, Tywin had found a certain harmony in that thunderous sound, but today he barely noticed it. His mind lingered on words he had rehearsed again and again in his head. Words meant for Joanna. The first rays of sunrise touched the edges of the world, gilding the horizon in pale gold that reminded him of his house sigil. Gold had always been central to House Lannister. Gold in their minds, gold in their hair, gold in their coffers, gold in their eyes, or so the realm would say. Yet gold did not warm a man's heart. It did not fix the ache of years spent shoring up alliances, forging alliances and breaking them when necessary. He had believed in duty, in the burden of leadership, in the rigid lines that kept a family strong. Yet somewhere in that unrelenting pursuit of dominion, he had made a grave sacrifice. He had let his feelings for Joanna remain unspoken, except behind closed doors. He had stifled the softness in his heart, because it seemed to conflict with the unyielding image of Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Shield of Lannisport, Warden of the West, and, for a time, Hand of the King. At last the sun rose fully, and with it, Tywin turned his feet away from the balcony's edge. He descended the winding stairs of smooth stone, mind running over the many tasks laid out before him, securing the western borders, ensuring the loyalty of his bannermen, mending bridges with certain noble families who had felt slighted. These obligations never ended. But perhaps for once, his personal desires would not remain submerged under responsibility. He walked with measured steps through the corridors of Casterly Rock. Torches and gilded sconces burned low, leaving only the faint aroma of smoke behind. Servants bowed or curtsied as he passed, going about their tasks quietly. Tywin usually offered them only a curt nod, always moving forward with purposeful strides. But that morning, he inclined his head slightly more than usual, or so it seemed, as if some hidden joy compelled him to acknowledge them as people, not just cogs in the vast machinery of the rock. There was one place within these walls that he knew he could always find solace. The private solar once used by his father, Tito's, and now by himself. Tywin had never found it as comforting as Tito's had. His father's too tender heart still lingered in the shadows of memory, a cautionary tale that shaped Tywin's every choice. But on the table near the window, overlooking a courtyard lined with redstone and marble, were the letters. Correspondences from across the realm. From King's Landing, from Dorne, from the Riverlands, from the Vale. Each demanded something of him. But there too was a letter from Joanna. He sat, smoothing the parchment with practiced fingers. Joanna's handwriting, bold yet elegant, carried with it an echo of the conversations they used to have in hushed tones, back when she was one of the few who could tease a wry smile from him. Through the lines she inquired after him, after the well-being of their children, after the state of the West. Yet nowhere did she say what Tywin yearned to hear. She did not speak of the words he had almost said many times, that he loved her beyond the constructs of duty or the necessity of producing heirs. That beneath his cold armor of authority lay a man who, once upon a time, had been a boy enthralled by her presence. He set the letter down, inhaled deeply, and felt a tremor in his hands. That tremor irritated him, and he squashed it. Men of House Lannister did not tremble. They did not allow themselves the luxury of frailty. But then again, men of House Lannister did not usually think of confessing affections, or reordering the realm's alliances in the name of love. Yet here he was, on the verge of throwing the dice in the name of peace, love, and the future of the entire kingdom. It was well known in the Seven Kingdoms that Tywin Lannister possessed a kind of ruthless brilliance. He had broken house reign when they rose against the Lannisters. He had been a fearsome hand of the king, feared and respected in equal measure, returning discipline to a court that threatened to spiral into chaos under King Aerys's drifting might. Many believed him incapable of gentleness. But Tywin knew the truth. His heart still beat, still loved. If confession could bring about not only personal peace, but also a general pacification of the realm, if a show of devotion might ripple outward and open new paths for alliances, then so be it. He stood abruptly, the decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. Duty and love had long been in opposition, or so it felt. He resolved to try a different path to merge these two forces. House Lannister's position was strong. Their wealth and influence were second to none, especially with an uncertain king still perched on the Iron Throne. If Tywin used his power differently, not simply as a hammer, but as a guiding hand toward peace, perhaps the realm's wounds could begin to mend. The first step would be to talk to Joanna herself, to bring into the light what had long been hidden. She was in her solar, he was told, reviewing the accounts of a minor banqueting expense. On the surface, it was an ordinary enough task, but one no less vital to the running of the castle's daily affairs. Tywin felt each step elongate as he walked. Time seemed to slow, memory flickering in the spaces between footfalls. He remembered her from childhood, the way her laughter echoed through halls that were otherwise suffocating in their solemn Lannister pride. He remembered how she could grin at him and make him feel, for a moment, that all the weight of the realm was not exclusively on his back. At last he reached the door. He had never felt so unprepared, yet he was Tywin Lannister. He had made the realm quake with decisions far less nerve-wracking. After a brief moment's hesitation, he pushed open the heavy wooden door. Joanna was seated at a small desk. The morning sunlight poured in from a narrow window, illuminating her golden hair and the gentle curve of her cheek. Her eyes lifted from the parchment before her, taking in his stern visage. She rose, offering a formal greeting. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence. He was not sure how to begin. Words that had seemed so certain in his mind twisted and blurred in the confines of his throat. Joanna's eyes softened. She knew him well enough to sense that this was no usual visit. She offered him a seat by the window, and he sat across from her at the little round table where he sometimes joined her for breakfast in quieter moments. She placed her hands upon the table. She waited. His voice was uncharacteristically low, steady yet carrying a hint of the sentiment he had caged for so many years. He spoke of the realm first, how conflict brewed in the east, how storms in the Reach had affected trade routes, how alliances might shift if the right gestures of goodwill were made. She listened patiently, but there was a faint wrinkle in her brow, as though she sensed that the real conversation had yet to begin. Tywin shifted in his seat, finally locking his gaze on her. Then, in words far simpler than his position might suggest, he spoke of his love for her. The revelation, so direct, made Joanna close her eyes for a moment. He expected shock or dismay, but her expression was neither. There was relief in her smile, mingled with a flicker of sadness. She touched the back of his hand with hers. He spoke next of how this love, if fully acknowledged, might serve as a beacon rather than a weakness. People saw him as cold, unfeeling. Some even said monstrous. He admitted as much. But that facade had always been about protecting what he treasured. His family, his children, Joanna herself. Yet by never declaring his true feelings, he had lived in near constant conflict, as though part of him were locked away, turning to stone. It was time to free that part of himself. Perhaps by doing so, they could model a new kind of rule, a new kind of alliance. Maybe together they could show the realm that there was more to House Lannister than gold and fury. Joanna's response was measured, but tears glistened in her eyes. She had waited long for him to speak these words openly. In her heart, she had always suspected his devotion, for Tywin was not the type of man to waste his care on idle concerns. But to hear it, to have him finally open this door, was like a sudden breeze in a stuffy room. She nodded once, gently, and her smile grew. She pledged her own love in return, love she had expressed in small ways, yet never so openly, for their world did not always reward vulnerability. For a long time, they sat together, clasping hands, the morning sun drifting slowly across the floor. There would be no turning back. Tywin considered the potential ripples of such a change. He would summon the lords of the West, call upon the old alliances in a new way, demonstrate that House Lannister, in its strength, was prepared to be gentle and just as well. The days of pure intimidation and cunning might not be wholly gone. He was still Tywin Lannister, but perhaps they would be tempered by a new approach. If the Western lords could unify under a banner of prosperity and stability, if they could set aside old grudges, then maybe the other great houses would follow suit. Maybe the realm could find a measure of peace, unshackled from the old cycles of bloodshed. They rose together from the table, and she kissed his cheek, a gesture of tenderness seldom exchanged between them in view of others. It was a beginning. The days that followed felt surreal to Tywin, as though he walked a path he had not anticipated. He summoned his most trusted bannermen to the rock. Lords and ladies arrived, each with their own concerns and suspicions. Many speculated privately about the reason for the summons. Tywin, ever the strategist, opened the meeting in the Great Hall with a typical show of authority, addressing matters of taxes and trade. The lordly assembly listened dutifully, exchanging the occasional glance. But then he brought Joanna forward, and in clear, resonant words, he acknowledged her as not just the mother of his children and Lady of Casterly Rock, but as his equal and his beloved. A stunned silence fell. This was no trifling announcement in Westerosi politics, no perfunctory display of courtesy. To see Tywin Lannister, known for his implacable will, speak of love so plainly was astonishing. Whispers rose and fell throughout the hall. Tywin did not waver. He went on to say that in honor of this, and in the spirit of forging a more united West, he intended to reduce certain levies on the lesser lords, to provide resources for them to rebuild roads, to strengthen trade routes among the domains. He offered them stability in exchange for loyalty, not through fear, but through mutual benefit. In short, he offered them a chance at prosperity if they would lay aside their internal rivalries and truly band under the banner of the Lion. At Joanna's subtle prompting, he further declared that House Lannister would fund a series of feasts and fairs throughout the West, encouraging the mixing of commoners and lords in a demonstration of goodwill. None could recall such a gesture from him before. At first, there was skepticism. Some lords remembered Tywin's iron-fisted rule, his swift retribution against any house that dared slight the Golden Lion. They wondered if this was merely a cunning ploy. Others, seeing the expression on Joanna's face, her gentle encouragement, thought perhaps there was sincerity in this. The realm might be heading toward chaos again. Rumors whispered of the king's poor health, of rebellions stirring in distant corners. If Tywin Lannister, with all his power, was now offering them a gentler path, perhaps it was safer to tread it. One by one, bannermen pledged themselves to this vision. Perhaps some did so out of fear, others out of calculated advantage, yet a few did so because they hoped it might indeed lead to something better for the people of the West. That same evening, a feast was held in the Great Hall, a lavish affair with roasted boar, spiced wine, and minstrels from Lannisport playing lively tunes. Tywin and Joanna sat side by side at the high table, something they had rarely done so openly in the past. Sir Kevan Lannister stood near them, watchful, quietly supportive. Kevan had always been Tywin's most dependable ally within the family, and though he was rarely demonstrative in his emotions, he showed cautious optimism for this new approach. Across the hall, the lords and ladies ate and drank and gossiped. The glow of torchlight reflected off Tywin's gilded cup. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to savor the moment rather than merely endure it as a necessary function of rule. Joanna leaned close to whisper a wry remark about Lord Brack's choice of doublet, and for a heartbeat, Tywin laughed softly, a sound that caused more than one head to turn in surprise. He caught a glimpse of how this night might be the start of real change, though he knew well that one feast would not undo years of intimidation and fear. Yet it was a step, and sometimes a single step was enough to set a realm on a new path. Word of Tywin's public confession of love, and his promise of a gentler reign, spread swiftly through the West. Ravens carried missives to the corners of the kingdom. The small folk in Lannisport murmured in taverns that perhaps the Lord of the Rock had found a heart after all. Traveling merchants carried tales to King's Landing of a kinder Tywin Lannister, stories that were met with disbelief or cautious interest in the capital's bustling streets. Diplomats from other regions waited to see whether this shift would hold. Within the walls of Casterly Rock, Tywin found himself forging new routines. Where once he would sequester himself with ledgers of debts owed to House Lannister, now he spent more time listening to Joanna's perspective on how to administer justice in the Western lands. She pointed out that a show of mercy could inspire loyalty among lesser houses that had once feared retribution for the slightest misstep. Tywin, never one to dabble in leniency, began to see the value in using a softer hand, so long as it did not undermine the house's authority. Together, they began drafting a code of conduct for Lannister bannermen, emphasizing the well-being of common folk and the fair treatment of those who might once have faced Tywin's wrath for trifling offenses. It was still firm. There would be no tolerance for banditry or rebellion, but it was balanced with opportunity for atonement. As weeks passed, envoys from other major houses arrived, each curious about this so-called pacification. Lord Hoster Tully sent a nephew to observe the new order in the West, while House Tyrell, suspicious of losing trade advantages, sent a diplomatic party to renegotiate certain arrangements. Even the North, remote and fiercely independent, dispatched a distant cousin of Lord Stark to gauge the changes. Tywin greeted them all with courteous formality, making sure they left with gifts and favorable impressions. Behind the scenes, he quietly consolidated alliances. He recognized that the realm was a delicate tapestry. Pulling one thread could unravel the entire cloth. Now he intended to weave a pattern of peace if he could manage it. Joanna became a central figure in these negotiations, her insight helping soften edges that Tywin might otherwise have left sharp. Her warmth offset his still imposing presence. Gradually, they found themselves hosting more social gatherings. Small dinners, hunting parties, tours of the Lannister mines for those curious about the region's wealth. These events were meant to show that House Lannister was open to cooperation instead of mere domination. This was not a simple process, nor was it without friction. Some lords balked at Tywin's newly minted courtesy, half convinced it was a ploy to lure them into complacency. Others tried to take advantage, thinking the lion had lost his roar. They were swiftly corrected by Kevin or by Tywin himself, but always with measured restraint. House Lannister had not forgotten how to defend its interests, and the occasional calculated display of force reminded all that the lion still had teeth. Amid these gatherings, Tywin found rare moments of tranquility with Joanna. Sometimes in the late evenings, they would walk the ramparts, discussing the day's events under the silver glow of moonlight. She would slip her arm through his, and together they would breathe in the crisp night air. These were moments he had never permitted himself in the past, convinced that closeness was a liability. Now he found them a source of strength. They spoke of their children's futures, of how best to ensure that the next generation did not inherit the grudges of old. They mapped out how to approach the more stubborn lords with offers of trade or betrothal to weave them firmly into the tapestry. Tywin marveled at how swiftly the weariness of his responsibilities diminished when shared with the one person he trusted entirely. Beyond Casterly Rock, the changes began to bear fruit. Travelers noted improved roads in the west, and local disputes were increasingly settled without bloodshed. Some doubted the transformation, but the results were difficult to deny. A few rebellious whispers emerged, claiming Tywin's new approach was a weakness, an aberration. Yet no open challenges arose, for the memory of Houses Rain and Tarbeck still loomed, a reminder of what befell those who defied the Rock too openly. And so the West settled into a cautious peace, while throughout the realm, lords and ladies watched and waited to see if Tywin truly meant to pacify not just his own region, but perhaps the entire kingdom. In King's Landing, the royal court pricked its ears at the rumor of Tywin Lannister's vow of love and new brand of rulership. The king, still volatile behind the walls of the Red Keep, sent word that he desired the presence of Tywin and Joanna at court. It was a summons that could not be ignored. Despite the tension that memory of the Mad King conjured, Tywin and Joanna prepared for the journey. If they were to bring peace to the Seven Kingdoms, they would have to face the seat of power head-on. The caravan that set forth from Casterly Rock was a grand one. Banners bearing the Golden Lion fluttered in the breeze. Knights rode at the head of the column, gleaming in plate armor, polished to a high sheen. Servants and attendants followed in wagons stocked with provisions. Joanna's carriage was richly appointed, but not ostentatious, reflecting the balance she encouraged between Lannister pride and measured humility. Tywin rode ahead on a towering warhorse, the gold buckle of his cloak catching the sunlight. Along the gold road, crowds of small folk gathered to watch them pass. Some offered cheers, a few looked on warily, unsure what to make of their formidable lord in his evolving guise. Tywin kept his gaze ahead, regal and stern, but occasionally he would turn to glance at Joanna's carriage, and a small nod passed between them. It seemed to strengthen them both. Evenings along the road were spent in comfortable pavilions, with guards posted against the dangers of bandits or roaming beasts. Around the campfires, knights and lesser lords shared stories and speculated on how the royal court would receive Tywin's overtures. Some believed the king would see it as an affront, a sign that Tywin was vying for greater influence. Others guessed the king might be pleased to see peace in the west, that it would give him breathing room to address the realm's other instabilities. Tywin listened but offered little comment, content to gather insights quietly. On the final night before reaching King's Landing, Tywin and Joanna stood together outside their tent, watching the firelight dance on the faces of the men-at-arms. The rolling hills gave way to distant silhouettes of farmland. Joanna asked if Tywin was prepared for whatever reception the king might give them. He considered, recalling the days when he had served as hand and had tried to maintain a stable reign under a monarch whose temper could spark like wildfire. He admitted he did not know for certain. But with her beside him, he felt a steadiness that belied the disquiet in his mind. He spoke of how, no matter the king's reaction, he would press forward in his endeavor to unify the realm, forging alliances that might outlast any one ruler's whims. Joanna nodded, her hand slipping into his. They stood in companionable silence, the warmth of the fire on their faces, the promise of a new dawn in their hearts. When the caravan arrived at the gates of King's Landing, it was met with fanfare. The gold and crimson of House Lannister stood in stark contrast to the dingy streets and towering red walls. Gossip preceded their arrival, and crowds lined the approach to the city's gates to glimpse the infamous Tywin Lannister, said to have discovered love in his later years. The city guard, clad in the gold cloaks that gave them their name, ushered them through to the Red Keep. There, in the throne room, King Aerys Targaryen awaited them. Age and paranoia had taken their toll on Aerys. His once handsome features were shadowed with suspicion. His fingers twitched against the arm of the Iron Throne, as though each rivet of twisted steel were whispering in his ear. Tywin and Joanna advanced with measured steps, their retinue behind them. Tywin offered a bow, Joanna a curtsy, both as protocol demanded. Aerys's eyes flickered with something like amusement, or perhaps contempt. The formalities commenced. Tywin, in the deep voice that had once commanded this very court, spoke of the West's newfound prosperity, the roads built, the harvests improved. He extended a pledge of support for the crown, should any threat to peace arise in the realm. Aerys listened with narrowed eyes, occasionally flicking his gaze to Joanna Dada. He made a show of mild surprise at her presence, of mocking wonder at the talk of love. He even leaned forward on the throne, regarding Tywin as one might regard a curious new breed of dog. Yet he did not overtly disparage Tywin's words. At last, after a long moment of silence, the king's lips curved into something like a smile. With a voice like the hiss of a blade leaving its sheath, he commended Tywin for showing loyalty to the crown by keeping the West strong and stable. He made light jests about tamed lions, but no direct threat accompanied them. Tywin, his composure intact, thanked the king for his graciousness. Joanna offered a polite inclination of her head. The tension in the hall was palpable. Yet for now, it seemed the king was content to observe how this drama might unfold. That night, Tywin and Joanna were given chambers in the Red Keep, chambers Tywin remembered well from his tenure as Hand. They were not as grand as the Hand's apartments he had once occupied, but they were comfortable. Once the doors were closed and they were alone, Joanna exhaled softly, as though setting down a weight she had been carrying. Tywin pulled off his gloves, placing them on a small table. Their eyes met. She asked if he believed the king was truly amenable to their aims. Tywin responded that Aerys had always been unpredictable, but he suspected that as long as the crown's authority was not undermined, Aerys would not stand directly in their way. Or so Tywin hoped. They remained at court in the days that followed, navigating a labyrinth of courtiers, alliances, and intrigue. The Red Keep pulsed with whispered rivalries and hidden agendas. Joanna was a calming influence. Her sincere interactions with other ladies at court drew them closer, gleaning tidbits of gossip and forging subtle connections. Tywin met with key lords and members of the King's Council, seeking to extend the pacification beyond the West, offering financial incentives for roads or trade in their own regions. He spoke of the benefits that peace could bring to all the great houses, lessening their burdens and allowing wealth to flow. Some, like the Master of Coin, were intrigued. Others remained wary, suspecting a trap. Bit by bit, Tywin stitched together a patchwork of interests, using House Lannister's considerable resources to buy goodwill. One evening, a royal banquet was held in honor of the Western delegates. The king presided, his mood mercurial as ever. His laughter rang out too loud at times. His anger flared unexpectedly at small slights. Tywin, ever watchful, danced the intricate steps of flattery and caution, ensuring that no comment he made could be twisted into an insult. Joanna wore a gown of Lannister red, her hair braided in a style that showcased her regality. Many eyes followed her, for a gentle grace radiated from her presence that had been sorely missed in a court often overshadowed by the king's volatility. As the night wore on, the king beckoned Tywin and Joanna closer. In a tone that could have been mistaken for jest, he asked if Tywin planned to wed Joanna anew, to celebrate this confession of love in front of the entire realm. The question hung in the air, a challenge and a provocation rolled into one. Courtiers fell silent, utensils paused midair. Tywin did not look away. His heart pounded a steady rhythm, but he kept his expression unreadable. He answered that his marriage to Joanna had always been a bond of loyalty and affection, though if it pleased his grace, they would renew their vows. The king's eyes gleamed as he studied them, perhaps hoping to find a crack in their composure. Finally, he clapped his hands and declared that a grand affair would be delightful. Yes, a wedding renewed, a chance to show the realm that even the mighty Tywin Lannister had a beating heart. Joanna, sensing the potential trap, merely smiled and voiced that if it pleased the king, they would be honored. And so, with capricious whim, Aerys set in motion a royal spectacle. The news traveled through King's Landing overnight. Tywin Lannister was to reaffirm his vows to Joanna in a lavish ceremony overseen by the Targaryen king himself. Some whispered that this was a test of Tywin's loyalty, that the king wanted to remind the realm that no one, not even Tywin, was beyond his command. Others speculated it might be the king's grudging acknowledgement of Tywin's new approach. Whatever the motive, the preparations began at once. A swirl of tailors and cooks, and minstrels set to make the event unforgettable. Tywin confided in Joanna that while he did not relish the idea of parading their private feelings, this might serve a greater purpose. It would show the entire court, and by extension the kingdom, that House Lannister truly stood behind this new direction. If they could endure the king's scrutiny and still make a show of unity and love, it might inspire other lords to follow suit. And, on a personal level, part of Tywin found the idea oddly appealing. A formal renewal of vows that had always been overshadowed by duty and the cold demands of Lannister pride. If the realm was to see them in full partnership, then let it see, and let it be the foundation of a more peaceful age. The day of the ceremony arrived with a hush of anticipation. The royal septuate was adorned with Lannister gold and Targaryen red, the colors intermingling in a dramatic display. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating the polished marble floors. Lords and ladies filled the pews, gossiping behind raised fans, scanning for any sign of tension. Tywin stood at the altar, clad in formal attire of black and gold, his posture impeccably straight. He waited for Joanna, ignoring the throng of eyes upon him. When the music swelled, she entered on Kevin's arm. A collective intake of breath rustled through the congregation. Her gown shimmered, a shade of ivory, with subtle golden embroidery. Her face was calm, her eyes bright. Behind her, a train of attendants and Lannister guards. Tywin felt a warmth spread through him at the sight of her, a profound sense of respect and affection. This was no political display, though it served that purpose too. This was his choice, his heart laid bare. The king presided from a seat of honor, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. The High Septon performed the rites, speaking the ancient words that bound two souls together before gods and men. Tywin repeated the vows, each word enunciated firmly. He recalled their first wedding, overshadowed by the burdens of House Lannister. This time, there was a sincerity in his voice that resonated in the vaulted ceilings of the Sept 8. When it was Joanna's turn, she spoke just as clearly, her gaze never leaving Tywin's face. She vowed to stand beside him, to share in his burdens and joys, to shape the future of their house and the realm with compassion and strength. There was no doubting the authenticity in her voice. The High Septon pronounced them reaffirmed in their union. Thunderous applause followed, though Tywin detected an undercurrent of tension from the royal seat. Aerys clapped, but his eyes glittered as though he were simultaneously entertained and unsettled by what he had witnessed. Outside the Sept, a grand procession carried them through the streets of King's Landing, flanked by gold cloaks and Lannister knights. Commoners peered from windows and doorways. Many cheered at the spectacle. Some simply gawked. Tywin maintained a dignified demeanor, but he would occasionally reach out to squeeze Joanna's hand. Though the city's intrigues lurked beneath the surface, for one day at least, there was celebration in the air. A royal feast followed in the great hall of the Red Keep. Tables groaned under the weight of succulent dishes, and musicians played jolly tunes. Tywin and Joanna sat at the high table next to the king, forced to endure his capricious conversation. Aerys offered toasts that veered from congratulatory to cutting. But Tywin and Joanna remained unflappable, answering graciously and leaving no room for the king to sink his claws into them. The lords and ladies observed, some envious, some admiring, some still suspicious. But there was an undeniable feeling in the hall that House Lannister was stronger than ever, and not just militarily or financially, but united in purpose. When the night wore on, and the revelers grew drunker, Tywin guided Joanna from the hall with a discreet nod. They retired to their chambers, away from prying eyes. Soft candlelight flickered against the chamber walls. A gentle breeze from Blackwater Bay drifted through the window. He looked at her then, and saw more than just his lady. He saw his partner in forging a new path for the realm. She gave him a wry smile, pleased with how they had managed to navigate the king's unpredictable temper. They exchanged no elaborate words. No further confessions of love were necessary. A quiet understanding settled between them, an acknowledgement that while the road ahead might be fraught, they would walk it side by side. In the following days, they quietly consolidated the goodwill generated by their renewed vows. Lords from the Crownlands and beyond approached them to discuss trade possibilities, marriages, alliances. Tywin steered each conversation toward stability, fairness, and mutual gain. Joanna's presence tempered any lingering hostility. She would invite the ladies to her solar, discuss shared interests, and subtly weave the narrative that a peaceful realm benefited all. King Aerys, for his part, did not directly obstruct them. Perhaps he found the spectacle entertaining, or perhaps he believed that by allowing Tywin to achieve this pacification, he would draw out any hidden threats and crush them later. Whatever his reasoning, Tywin and Joanna made careful use of the respite. They planned a new initiative, a council of lords meant to address regional disputes before they escalated. It was an ambitious undertaking, one that would require the blessing of the king. Tywin made his case in the throne room one afternoon, outlining how such a council could prevent costly rebellions and unify the Seven Kingdoms. Aerys listened, occasionally drumming his fingers on the Iron Throne. Then, in an abrupt decision, he granted permission, though he did so with a dismissive wave, as if it were a trifle. Tywin wasted no time. He penned invitations to each great house, requesting they send representatives to a gathering in the west, where they would discuss cooperative measures to maintain peace. Some might refuse, seeing it as a move to place Tywin in a central position of power. But over time, the realm had grown weary of endless feuds. House Baratheon had its own troubles, House Tully and House Arryn likewise. House Stark maintained its distance from southern affairs. House Martell nursed old grievances, but was never opposed to negotiations if they had something to gain. House Tyrell held the fertile lands of the Reach, but they too wanted stable trade routes. Tywin relied on all these mutual benefits to coax them toward the table. With the king's tacit approval in hand, Tywin and Joanna departed King's Landing under the watchful gaze of courtiers who wondered if the West would truly become the nucleus of a more peaceful realm. Their caravan left behind the rancid smells of the city for the open road once more, banners catching the wind, knights riding proud. The journey home was accompanied by a kind of hopeful expectancy, though Tywin kept his expectations grounded in realism. Peace was a delicate creature, easily scared off by pride or treachery. Yet for the first time, he felt that they had a genuine chance to usher in something lasting. Back at Casterly Rock, they set about preparing for the Grand Council. The fortress's massive halls and courtyards were spruced up, though it was already a marvel of construction. Rooms were allotted for the visiting lords and their retinues. Kitchens bustled with the planning of feasts. Cellars were inventoried for the best wines. Joanna oversaw the details, ensuring that the accommodations would reflect both Lannister might and genuine hospitality. One by one, envoys and lords began to arrive. House Tully's envoys came in carriages adorned with fish sigils, House Arryn's knights with the falcon standard, House Baratheon's storm-colored banners, House Tyrell's rose-laden pageantry, and even a small contingent from Dorne, their sun and spear shining in the western sunlight. There was tension, of course. Some houses had centuries of grievances, but the invitation had been accepted, if cautiously. Tywin and Joanna greeted each delegation personally. Tywin's bearing, though imperious, was leavened by a practiced courtesy. Joanna's warmth provided a bridge when the atmosphere grew too stiff. The council convened in the Great Hall, where Tywin had once held summits with his bannermen alone. Now the hall was filled with nobles from all corners of the realm, their distinctive attire creating a kaleidoscope of colors. The first session was tense, each delegation sizing up the others, uncertain of Tywin's ultimate aims. But Tywin began by acknowledging their concerns outright, stating that he was aware the realm had been divided by the ambitions of various lords, by the contradictions of the king's rule, and by the weight of history itself. He spoke with the same calm authority that had once brought rebellious houses to heel. But this time, he wielded it to propose cooperation rather than submission. He introduced Joanna to the assembly as his partner in this endeavor, openly expressing that she had guided him to see a path of unity. Some scoffed at the idea of a lady playing a major role in shaping policy, but Tywin quelled them with a sharp glance. He praised House Lannister's prosperity, but clarified that it was in the interest of all great houses for the entire kingdom to flourish. After all, even the lion could fall if the realm fell apart. He invited the delegations to share their region's specific grievances and needs. Some were reluctant, but as the hours wore on, issues were laid on the table. Shipping disputes in the Narrow Sea, border tensions between the Reach and the Stormlands, the North's desire for autonomy and fair trade routes, Dorne's constant push to remain distinct while still reaping the benefits of trade and alliances. Joanna sat close by taking note of each concern, occasionally suggesting a point of compromise or an idea for mutual benefit. The presence of the Targaryen banner in the hall reminded them all that, ultimately, the king presided over them. Yet the king himself was absent, too immersed in his own labyrinthine thoughts back in King's Landing. Perhaps it was that very absence that allowed the discussions to proceed. With no immediate threat of the king's caprice, the lords and ladies dared to speak more freely. Days passed in deliberation. Tensions flared. Harsh words were exchanged. Tywin maintained order with a firm hand, reminding everyone that they had come to negotiate, not quarrel. As the arguments turned heated, Joanna would interject with a question or a gentle reminder of the bigger picture, nudging the conversation back on track. Bit by bit, proposals were drafted. The concept of a rotating council was raised, wherein each major house would send representatives to meet twice a year, ensuring that issues could be addressed before they escalated. Suggestions for standardizing certain trade tariffs across the regions were presented, which would reduce friction at the borders. Even discussions about mutual defense pacts began to take shape. The idea being that if one region was threatened, the others might unite to deter invaders or rebels. It was not all agreement and harmony, far from it. House Martell chafed at anything that might infringe on its traditional independence, and House Baratheon insisted it would not be beholden to decisions made in the West. But Tywin leveraged his house's wealth and connections, offering to invest in shipyards in the Stormlands, for instance, or guaranteeing grain shipments to Dorne during scarce harvests. These tangible concessions wore down resistance. House Tyrell, always watchful of trade advantages, found itself compelled by the idea of stable routes that would let them move their surplus harvests further north. House Tully, with a strong tradition of family and community, was open to any measure that promoted peace. House Arryn, perched high in the Vale, remained cautious but recognized the potential to secure more trade through mountain passes if the roads were safe. Amid these intense negotiations, Tywin noticed small gestures that filled him with guarded hope. A Baratheon knight sharing a drink with a Tyrell bannerman and laughing over a story of a common foe. A Martell envoy politely praising the crispness of Lannister wine. A pair of Northmen forging a tentative friendship with a Tully retainer over a game of Sivas. These subtle interactions hinted at the possibility of bridging divides that had seemed insurmountable. When the final proposals were compiled, they reflected compromise more than victory or defeat for any single house. Regional autonomy was largely preserved, but certain overarching agreements were put in place. Standardized trade tariffs on specific goods, a commitment to peaceful resolution of border disputes through arbitration, shared investment in infrastructural projects to improve roadways, and a schedule for council sessions to be held at least once annually in a rotating location. Each house's representative would sign the documents in the presence of the others. It was a fragile arrangement, reliant on trust that might still crack under pressure, but it was a step forward that Westeros had not seen for generations. The concluding ceremony was held in the courtyard of Casterly Rock, beneath the towering statue of the Golden Lion. Each delegation affixed its seal to the parchment. Then, in a gesture that was part tradition, part pageantry, Tywin and Joanna hosted a final feast. It was a sumptuous affair, with food and drink enough to fill the bellies of knights and lords 100 times over. Minstrels played lively tunes and dancers whirled across the courtyard. The mood, while still laced with caution, was a marked improvement over the hostility that might have ruled such a gathering in years past. Watching from a balcony above, Tywin stood with Joanna at his side, his arm resting lightly around her waist. He observed the mixing of colors, the swirl of sigils that usually only converged in times of war or royal weddings. Here they were, sharing stories, forging friendships, or at the very least refraining from open scorn. The realm was far from united in its heart, but it was a beginning. He gazed at Joanna, who wore a satisfied smile and felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended any victory he had achieved through fear or force in earlier years. He silently thanked her for guiding him toward this path, one that required not only might, but also vulnerability, empathy, and a willingness to speak truths that had long been concealed. That night, after the guests had retired or dispersed to their chambers, Tywin and Joanna again strolled the ramparts of Casterly Rock. The moon was nearly full, casting silver across the sea. The wind carried the scent of salt. Tywin reflected on the transformations that had taken place. From his confession of love to Joanna, to the forging of a fragile peace that might span the 7 kingdoms. He admitted to her that he was still uncertain if it would endure. The realm was vast and complicated, old hatreds ran deep, and the king's unpredictability loomed in the distance. Joanna squeezed his arm reassuringly. She pointed out that no peace was permanent, yet each day of harmony was a step away from chaos. They had already accomplished more than many believed possible. If they continued this approach, combining House Lannister's strength with compassion and fair dealing, perhaps the realm could find a measure of stability. They paused at a crenellation, looking out at the moonlit waters. Tywin turned to her, placing a hand on her cheek. He spoke quietly, telling her that in all his years of struggle and ambition, he had never felt so fulfilled as he did now, standing there with her, having reshaped the legacy of House Lannister into something that might do more than inspire fear. She leaned into his touch, her eyes shining in the pale light. She told him that she had always believed in his capacity for greatness, and not just the ruthless sort. The wind rustled their hair, carrying away the faint echo of voices from the courtyard below, where knights still toasted each other's health. They stood together, the lion and his lady, aware that while the night was peaceful, storms could still gather on the horizon. Yet within that moment, they found solace and hope. Tywin had confessed his love, not only in words but in action. He had chosen a path that might pacify the realm, or at least begin to sow the seeds of unity. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and full of challenges, but illuminated by the faint glow of possibility. And for Tywin Lannister, that was enough. In the quiet hours before dawn, Tywin walked alone through the courtyard where the recent feast had taken place. Tables had been cleared, torches extinguished, and the flags of visiting houses taken down with ceremonial care. Only the lingering scent of spilled wine and trampled flowers remained as evidence of the gathering that had, for the moment, united so many disparate lords. He paused by a discarded garland, half crushed beneath a bench. A single pink rose petal lay atop the dark stone, a small testament to how fragile beauty could be amid the harsh realities of power. He bent to pick up the petal, pressing it between two fingertips. In the dim starlight, it looked almost pale white rather than pink. He shut his eyes, remembering glimpses of the feast, the swirl of conversation, the cautious smiles from northern lords, the half-hidden suspicion in the eyes of Dornish envoys, the forced camaraderie of men who had been, only years ago, on opposite sides of bitter feuds. Yet, they had come together in the spirit of forging something new. If that something was an illusion, it was at least an illusion that might buy time for a more lasting peace. He straightened and let the petal float to the ground. The hush of the courtyard felt immense, a cathedral of silence. Tomorrow, or in the days to come, delegations would depart Casterly Rock, returning to their homelands with stories of these negotiations. Tywin hoped they carried not only the memory of feasting, but the deeper imprint of unity. If trouble did arise again in the future, as trouble always did, perhaps they would remember these days of compromise. Perhaps they would see that the old ways of unchecked vengeance benefited no one. He turned toward the interior halls, mounting a spiral staircase that led to his private solar. The corridor was lit by a single bracketed torch, casting flickers across the walls. He passed tapestries depicting scenes of House Lannister's past triumphs. For a moment, he considered how many battles these woven images commemorated. Blood spilled, lives, houses undone. The West had flourished, yes, but at a cost. Still, the realm recognized the lion for its power, and power could now be harnessed to guide them toward less brutal ends. A guard outside his solar saluted quietly. Tywin inclined his head in acknowledgement, and stepped inside, his boots echoing on polished stone. The space was modest compared to the vast hallways and chambers that made up the main keep, but it was still an impressive room. Shelves lined with ledgers and scrolls took up an entire wall. A map of Westeros stretched across a table in the center, small wooden markers showing the positions of major houses. He approached that table and rested his hands on its edge, gazing down at the markers. His eyes drifted to the north, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, Dorne. At each region, there was a new or renewed bond, however fragile, brokered by these past weeks of negotiation. Joanna entered quietly, having seen the glow of candlelight from beneath the door. She wore a simple robe of crimson velvet, her hair unbound from its braids. He glanced up, relieved to see her. She offered him a faint smile and came to stand beside him, her gaze following his to the wooden pieces scattered across the map. He told her softly that it was a strange thing to stand over a map of the 7 kingdoms and contemplate peace rather than war. She agreed, touching one marker, a small lion representing Casterly Rock, and sliding it ever so slightly closer to another carved piece representing Highgarden. She confessed that she felt a guarded optimism. She had witnessed the forging of new friendships, or at least cordial alliances, during the feast. It might not be enough to banish centuries of mistrust, but seeds had been planted. Tywin placed his hand over hers, recognizing how important it was to keep her perspective in his mind. Left to his own devices, he might have reverted to the iron grip that had once characterized House Lannister. But together, they could try something else. He guided her to a nearby bench, and they sat, side by side, the map before them like a puzzle still being solved. She brought up the question that lingered in both their minds: what would the king do now? Aerys had shown an odd tolerance for these negotiations, but who could say how long that mood would last? If, at any moment, the king decided to undermine the entire endeavor, he had the authority to do so. Tywin's jaw tightened slightly as he admitted that was a real possibility. Yet he had laid the groundwork for a structure that might survive, even if the king turned against it. The newly formed Council of Lords did not exist merely at the king's pleasure. It was owned by mutual interest. And if there was one thing Tywin understood deeply, it was that self-interest was often more powerful than law or tradition. Each house now had a reason to protect the arrangement. They discussed the possibility of inviting royal representatives to the next council session, a gesture that might placate or at least engage the king, ensuring that the monarchy felt included. Tywin believed that as long as the king saw no threat to his throne, he might allow it. Joanna agreed, pointing out that an invitation could give Aerys the illusion of directing this new peace, even if the impetus truly came from Tywin and the realm's need for stability. With a subtle nod, Tywin resolved to send a missive to King's Landing soon, offering just such an invitation. He escorted Joanna back through the castle corridors until they reached their private chambers. At the threshold, she pressed her palm lightly against his chest, letting him know that as weary as the negotiations had made them, she still felt gratitude for the progress they had achieved. He leaned in and touched his forehead to hers, a fleeting moment of tenderness. Then they parted for the night, each thinking of the burdens that would greet them at first light. Morning brought the stir of departure. Lords, knights, and attendants making ready to leave Casterly Rock. Horses were led from the stables, wagons were loaded, ravens were dispatched. Tywin stood atop the steps in the courtyard, Joanna at his side, to bid formal farewells. One by one, delegations approached, expressing gratitude or polite neutrality, offering last words of courtesy, sometimes straining to keep old grudges submerged. Lord Tito's Blackwood, representing the Riverlands in lieu of Lord Tully, thanked Tywin for his hospitality. A representative of House Oakhart from the Reach promised to carry news of these accords home. A pale, sharp-eyed envoy from Dorne bowed stiffly but said little, merely stating that her prince would consider what had been discussed. Tywin nodded to each, gleaning from subtle intonations whether they left on good terms or carried hidden discontent. When at last the courtyard emptied of most visitors, the only stragglers were a few lesser knights from the Vale, exchanging pleasantries with Lannister guards, and a handful of courtiers who had lingered to enjoy the Rock's famed vantage point. Tywin felt a measure of relief. The weight of hosting such a crucial council had pressed on him daily. Now the real test lay ahead, in whether these lords would uphold their agreements once they returned to their own strongholds. He returned to the great hall, where Kevan awaited him. Kevan's steady presence had been a constant throughout these negotiations, ensuring that no petty scuffle flared out of control. Though not as ambitious or commanding as his older brother, Kevan had a knack for practical solutions and a calm demeanor that set others at ease. He told Tywin that the accounts for the feast were in order, the final sums tallied, and that the next priority might be to send envoys to Lannisport to ensure the shipping lanes would be ready for new trade with the Stormlands and Dorne. Tywin nodded, making mental notes for future tasks. Word arrived by Raven just after midday that a small retinue from King's Landing would soon be visiting. The message bore the king's seal, indicating that his representatives wished to see firsthand how the West was implementing these new policies. Tywin read the letter carefully. The tone was formal, neither overtly hostile nor entirely friendly. Likely the king wanted reassurance that Tywin's efforts did not undermine the crown. Perhaps it was a ploy to find weaknesses. Tywin set the parchment aside and glanced at Joanna, who had entered the hall moments before. She read his expression and understood. They would have visitors again, sooner than expected. Preparations began. At least Casterly Rock was still adorned and stocked from the recent council. Tywin and Joanna ordered fresh linens for the royal guests, and had their best rooms readied, though not the ones reserved for the highest possible dignitaries. There was a subtle hierarchy to maintain. They also ensured that the new roads leading from Lannister to Casterly Rock were in good repair, so the royal envoys would see tangible evidence of improvement. Tywin believed in showing results, not just words, especially where suspicious eyes might look for flaws. Days later, the king's envoys arrived, a trio of courtiers with slender pale faces and impeccable attire, accompanied by a small contingent of gold-cloaked guards. Their leader introduced himself as Sir Miles Rosby, a soft-spoken knight known to be close to the king's ear. He offered polite greetings but did not mask the reason for his visit: to observe how well these peaceful innovations aligned with King Aerys' vision for the realm. Tywin feigned courteous welcome. Joanna greeted them warmly, insisting they must be tired from the journey. The courtiers, accustomed to the intrigues of the Red Keep, showed no outward sign of acceptance or refusal, merely inclining their heads and following her lead. Over the next few days, Tywin arranged tours of the West for these observers. They visited the improved roads, the bustling markets of Lannisport, and a few smaller towns where House Lannister had sent funds to rebuild wells and barns. The king's men took notes, asked questions of local magistrates, and watched the interactions between lords and smallfolk. Tywin did not attempt to hide the residual wariness that still existed among some lesser houses, but he emphasized the growing cooperation. He spoke of a future when trade flows might enrich all corners of the realm. Joanna assisted, sharing stories of small acts of unity that might otherwise go unnoticed, like local families who sold produce in Lannisport markets, now paying less tax due to Lannister reforms. Each evening, the royal envoys dined with Tywin and Joanna, where conversation was civil but guarded. Sir Miles Rosby probed gently, referencing the king's authority at every turn. Tywin responded calmly, acknowledging the crown's rightful place. His words were carefully chosen to suggest that he was acting in concert with the king's broader interests. Joanna's presence and remarks about the human elements of these reforms leavened the tension, making Tywin's approach seem less calculating. On the final night of the visit, the envoys were treated to a small feast in the same courtyard where the great council banquet had taken place. This time, the gathering was more intimate. Just Lannister loyalists, a few minor lords, and the three visitors. As torches flickered against the stone walls, music filled the air. One of the visitors, a court official with silver-streaked hair, commented on how unexpectedly convivial the West seemed. Tywin suspected the man's words carried a note of irony, but he merely offered a polite smile. After the feast, Sir Miles Rosby requested a private audience with Tywin and Joanna. They led him to a nearby antechamber, where the crackling of a low fire provided the only sound. Sir Miles folded his hands, inclining his head in a gesture that was half respectful, half watchful. He began by relaying that the king was pleased to hear of the West's newfound stability, but naturally he desired reassurance that no coalition was forming against the Iron Throne. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Tywin was not surprised. He explained that the accords forged at Casterly Rock served the king's interest, reducing the likelihood of rebellion by addressing root causes: border disputes, trade imbalances, and the frustration of lesser lords who felt ignored by the crown. A stable, prosperous realm reflected well on King Aerys. Joanna nodded quietly, adding that, as someone who had grown up within the shadow of the Red Keep's power, she believed the only true way to avoid future strife was to give every region a stake in peace. By her tone alone, Sir Miles seemed mildly persuaded that there was no subterfuge afoot. He softened slightly, removing a small scroll from inside his cloak. The seal, once again, bore the royal dragon. He informed them that the king wished to extend an invitation. Tywin and Joanna were requested once more in King's Landing, to be honored for their efforts in maintaining the realm's security. Sir Miles added that the king might even consider adopting certain aspects of these reforms in other parts of Westeros, provided Tywin could demonstrate their efficacy. The subtlety of the request did not go unnoticed. Aerys was not giving Tywin orders. He was holding out a tempting lure. The underlying message was clear. If Tywin's new brand of leadership truly worked, the king would support it, but if there were any cracks or hidden ambitions, they would not survive the glare of royal scrutiny. Tywin glanced at Joanna, who met his eyes with a calm resolve. This was the next step they had anticipated, forging a direct connection between the king's authority and the Western reforms. Tywin stated that they would be honored to return to King's Landing and demonstrate how the realm could move forward together. Sir Miles inclined his head, satisfied. He folded the scroll again, secured it, and promised to deliver their acceptance to the king. The days after the king's envoys departed passed in a blur of preparation. If they were to go to King's Landing, they would do so with a retinue that demonstrated both the strength and the moderated approach of House Lannister. Knights and courtiers were selected carefully, chosen for their ability to maintain decorum and to speak knowledgeably about the West's accomplishments. Meanwhile, Kevin would remain at Casterly Rock to manage day-to-day affairs, as well as to keep an eye on any potential unrest while Tywin and Joanna were gone. Joanna oversaw the selection of gifts for the royal court. Items that could reinforce the notion of goodwill, without seeming ostentatious or braggadocious. She arranged for fine Lannister goldwork, a series of beautifully wrought goblets etched with scenes of hunts in the West, and bolts of crimson and gold cloth. Tywin approved each choice with a watchful eye, wanting to ensure that the king's vanity was indulged just enough to keep suspicion at bay. Before they departed, Tywin summoned a council of his local lords and bannermen, instructing them to continue implementing reforms. Roads, trade, and fairness in local disputes were to be upheld. He made it clear that he expected no slip into the old ways of intimidation or petty feuding. Few dared to question him openly, though he could see curiosity in their faces. Was this pacification truly lasting, or just a passing strategy? On a crisp morning, the Lannister caravan left Casterly Rock. Tywin led the column on horseback, clad in a dark cloak fastened by a gold lion's head clasp. Joanna traveled in a well-appointed carriage, though she occasionally joined him on horseback when the road was smooth. A small swarm of knights in red and gold livery rode at their front, while wagons full of supplies and gifts followed. The standard of the Golden Lion rippled in the wind, a proud emblem of the West's power and a symbol, they hoped, of a new era of cooperation. They reached Lannisport first, a bustling city that had grown more prosperous in recent months, thanks to improved trade. Merchants and townsfolk lined the streets to watch the procession. Some cheered, others simply gazed in respect. Tywin noted fewer signs of destitution than he'd once observed, an indication that the reforms might be working, even if only in small increments. The roads eastward led them through rolling plains and occasional farmland. At each halt, they found local lords eager to host them, to glean any favor or to witness firsthand the rumored changes in Tywin's demeanor. Joanna's warmth endeared them to the local ladies, who showered her with compliments or tentative questions about life at Casterly Rock. Despite the outward ease of travel, Tywin remained vigilant. Ambushes, brigands, or plots, hatched by those threatened by Lannister influence, could arise at any time. He had not forgotten the nature of power in Westeros. But no incident took place. The roads had never been safer. Even opportunistic outlaws thought twice about attacking the personal escort of Lord Tywin. As they drew closer to King's Landing, the rural scenery gave way to more populated areas, small towns and hamlets that dotted the landscape. Whispers of the Lannister approach seemed to precede them, for at each settlement, people peeked from windows or gathered in clusters to watch the caravan pass. Most seemed curious rather than frightened or hostile. News of Tywin's softened rule, and the rumors of his deep devotion to Joanna had spread, and it sparked endless speculation. Some dismissed it as a ploy, others as a sign the lion had indeed found a gentler heart. At last, the walls of King's Landing loomed ahead. The city sprawl spread outward, a chaotic tapestry of narrow streets, market stalls, and cramped houses. The smell hit them before the sight of the Red Keep's towers, a potent mix of sea air, refuse, animal dung, and cooking fires. Tywin had always found the city's stench distasteful, but he rode through the gate with an impassive face, leading the caravan past the gold cloaks posted at the entrance. Joanna, in her carriage, cringed slightly at the odor, but kept her composure. Once inside, the caravan's progress slowed. The throng of people, carts, and animals made for difficult passage. Vendors hawked goods, beggars called out, horses whickered in protest at the cramped space. Lannister knights skillfully guided the party through, their discipline evident. Whenever possible, the crowd parted, mindful of the armed escort. They wound their way toward the Red Keep, which rose in the distance, perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the Blackwater. The gold and red banners of House Lannister stood out starkly against the city's drab colors, catching the eyes of onlookers. Some stared with awe, others with undisguised skepticism or fear. Eventually, they ascended the winding road that led to the castle gates. There, a herald stepped forward to formally announce their arrival. Tywin dismounted, handing his reins to a squire. Joanna emerged from her carriage, her gown immaculate despite the dust of travel. Together they advanced under the archway, where a royal steward greeted them with a perfunctory bow. He motioned them inside, while the rest of the caravan was directed to the courtyard stables and guest quarters. The Red Keep's corridors were as Tywin remembered. Broad halls lined with imposing statues and hanging banners. Flickering torches casting shadows on stone floors. They were led deeper into the castle, where they were shown to a suite of chambers prepared for them. The steward mentioned that the king expected them to dine in his presence that very evening. Tywin thanked him without emotion, and once alone, exchanged a look with Joanna. They both understood the demands of the game. There would be no period of rest or adjustment. The king would want to see them immediately, to measure them with his gaze, to see if their power threatened him or glorified him. Joanna surveyed the chambers, ensuring they were suitable. They were not as spacious as the apartments once reserved for the hand of the king during Tywin's tenure, but they were comfortable enough. Tapestries depicting Targaryen conquests hung on the walls, a reminder that this was the seat of dragon kings. Servants scurried in, offering refreshments, filling basins with water for washing off the dust of the road. Tywin noticed that a few had watchful expressions, as though tasked with observing every glance and gesture. He kept his face impassive. They dressed for the royal meal in silence, except for the occasional quiet remark about the arrangement of jewelry or the fold of a cloak. Tywin wore formal attire of deep burgundy, trimmed with gold, a simpler version of court dress that avoided looking ostentatious. Joanna chose a gown of dark red with subtle gold embroidery at the cuffs. She allowed her hair to be pinned up, showcasing a slender gold chain that fell across her collarbone. They looked every inch the power couple of the West, but they had toned down the grandeur. In King's Landing, an overly bold display could be seen as a challenge. At the appointed hour, they proceeded to the throne room. Torchlight blazed along the walls, reflecting off the black marble floor. Rows of courtiers parted as Tywin and Joanna entered, their footsteps echoing. At the far end of the hall stood the Iron Throne, a mass of twisted swords forged in dragonfire centuries ago. On it sat King Aerys Targaryen, draped in flowing robes of midnight blue embroidered with silver dragons. The king's once handsome face had grown lined and thin, and there was a restlessness in his eyes that suggested he never truly slept at ease. Beside him stood a few of his advisors and guards. The assembled courtiers watched in silence as Tywin and Joanna advanced and bowed. Aerys leaned forward, his voice carrying a curious edge as he welcomed them back to King's Landing. He made a remark about how the West seemed so far away, as if it were its own separate kingdom. A jest, perhaps, or a barbed insinuation. Tywin offered a measured response, thanking the king for his invitation and affirming that the West remained loyal to the Iron Throne. The king shifted on the jagged seat of swords, as though testing their sharpness against his spine. He praised the reforms Tywin had introduced, though his tone was laced with a faint mocking note. Then he invited them to dine in the smaller hall, an intimate setting where they might speak more freely. The audience in the throne room dispersed, murmuring as they went. Curiosity piqued. Tywin and Joanna followed the king and his retinue through a side passage into a richly appointed dining chamber. A long table, set with fine silverware and exotic dishes, awaited them. Servants hovered discreetly along the walls. Aerys took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for Tywin and Joanna to place themselves at his right. Others in the king's circle filled in around them. From the first bite, the meal was a performance. Aerys dissected every detail of the West's pacification efforts, occasionally pausing to savor his wine or to level a probing look at Tywin. He asked about the possibility of forging a large-scale agreement for the entire realm. He spoke in elliptical phrases, referencing the building of new fleets in King's Landing, or the possibility of awarding new titles to those who showed exceptional loyalty. His eyes flicked to Joanna at times, perhaps weighing her presence or reminding himself that she had once been a lady of the court. Joanna played her role flawlessly. She answered softly when asked about roads and trade, always giving credit to the king's overarching vision. She never overstepped, never contradicted Tywin, but her warmth and genuine intelligence shone through. Aerys seemed entertained, though one could never tell if the king's interest was benign or sinister. Tywin maintained an aura of calm, describing how the councils of lords had opened lines of communication between regions, how the real advantage lay not in subjugation, but in incentivizing peace. He emphasized that a stable realm meant fewer rebellions to crush, fewer taxes spent on war. He slipped in praise for the king's wisdom, sprinkling just enough sycophancy to keep the conversation smooth. As the meal concluded, Aerys beckoned a servant forward with a silver tray. On it lay a small crystal decanter filled with a mysterious amber liquid. The king poured 3 cups himself. One for Tywin, one for Joanna, one for his own hand. He proposed a toast to the West, to House Lannister, and to the shining future of the 7 kingdoms under Targaryen rule. Tywin noticed a flicker in the king's eyes, as though daring them not to drink. He and Joanna raised their cups and sipped. The liquid was fiery, laced with spice, likely some rare liquor from Essos. Aerys let out a low chuckle, pleased by their compliance. Then he drained his own cup in a single swallow. Later, in their assigned chambers, Tywin removed his cloak and sat heavily in a carved wooden chair. Joanna stood by the window, the flickering lights of King's Landing spread out beneath her. She observed that Aerys still radiated that sense of precarious unpredictability, something she remembered from her earlier years at court. Tywin concurred that the king's mind was a labyrinth, but for the moment, it seemed that Aerys was more curious than threatened by the West's new approach. He had not displayed open hostility or accused Tywin of usurping the crown's authority. That alone was a small victory. The following days were spent in a series of formal receptions, private audiences, and smaller gatherings. Tywin and Joanna navigated them with care, always aware that each remark could be seized upon by the king or his courtiers. They spoke at length with the Master of Coin, outlining the financial advantages of stable trade routes. They assured the Master of Laws that the new local councils would reduce legal disputes that once clogged the royal courts. They hinted to the Master of Whispers that their approach was quelling discontent in the West, thus decreasing the realm's need for spy masters to chase every rumor of revolt. At each step, they laced their words with the message that the king's seat of power was strengthened, not weakened, by this pacification. It was not lost on them that many at court eyed them with a mix of envy and fear. After all, Tywin had once been Hand, and his influence had overshadowed King Aerys' reign in the eyes of many. Now, returning with a unified West at his back, he cut an even more imposing figure. But so long as Tywin's purpose seemed supportive of the crown, no one could openly condemn him. Joanna found herself caught in the swirl of ladies at court, who peppered her with questions about her rumored influence over Tywin's reforms. She answered demurely, never directly admitting how central her role had been, but leaving enough hints to intrigue them. A few confided that they wished their own lords would learn from House Lannister's example and consider the welfare of the small folk more seriously. Joanna realized that beneath the polished surface of the court, there were pockets of genuine goodwill, men and women who longed for something better than constant political strife. They might prove to be silent allies if the crown's mood shifted. An undercurrent of anxiety permeated the Red Keep, as though at any moment, the king's temper might ignite. Servants whispered that Aerys's fits of paranoia were worsening. Some nights, he locked himself in his private chambers with only a single guard, emerging at dawn with wild, bloodshot eyes. Tywin noted these rumors but said little. He privately worried that the king's growing instability could undermine everything they'd worked toward, or even lead to catastrophic decisions that might incite rebellion. The best he could do was to solidify alliances among the more level-headed lords at court, ensuring that if the king did lash out, a coalition of sensible nobles might contain the damage. Days turned to weeks. Tywin and Joanna maintained their composure, attending to the king's demands. They showcased how local councils in the West had begun to provide fairer resolutions to disputes, how trade was flourishing on roads once fraught with bandits, how even Dorne and the Stormlands had parted from Casterly Rock with cautious optimism. Aerys took a mercurial interest in these updates, sometimes congratulating Tywin on his foresight, other times throwing out insinuations that the lion was growing too powerful. Tywin's responses were always measured, deflecting praise back to the king while sidestepping accusations of ambition. At length, the king surprised them by calling a grand session in the throne room, inviting key figures from the royal council, various lords present in King's Landing, and Tywin and Joanna themselves. The herald's voice carried through the hall, echoing across the pillars and the assembled courtiers. Tywin felt a ripple of tension in the air. Aerys was unpredictable, and now he had an audience of hundreds before him. The king ascended the Iron Throne like a stage performer, running his fingers along the jagged edges of steel, an oddly rapturous look on his face. He addressed the hall with dramatic flair, praising the long history of Targaryen rule, the unification of the Seven Kingdoms under Dragonfire, and the sacrifices made by great kings in ages past. His voice rose and fell, captivating attention, though many listened with uneasy caution. Then he spoke of the efforts in the West to quell unrest, calling upon Tywin to step forward. Tywin advanced, head held high, ignoring the whispers in the crowd. Joanna stood at the front of the gathered lords, watching intently. Aerys demanded that Tywin describe, in detail, how these new councils functioned, and why they had managed to keep peace where so many old methods had failed. Tywin delivered a concise explanation, speaking confidently about sharing responsibility, giving local lords a stake in stability, and ensuring the welfare of common folk as a deterrent to rebellion. He cited specific examples. Bandit attacks reduced, trade revenues increased, petty feuds resolved without drawing swords. Aerys listened with rapt attention, head tilted at a curious angle. When Tywin finished, the king let the silence draw out, as if savoring the suspense. Then, in a voice that seemed to reverberate across the throne room, he declared that the realm would attempt a similar model in key areas outside the West, starting with the Crownlands. He would appoint local councils under the Crown's supervision to test if this approach could indeed pacify the more troublesome regions. A faint gasp rippled through the hall. Tywin remained impassive, though inwardly he felt relief and surprise. Joanna's eyes flickered with a brief smile. This was a significant shift, a potential endorsement of the notion that peaceful reforms could be extended beyond Tywin's dominion. But the king was not done. He turned his gaze, oddly fervent, on Tywin and demanded to know, would Lord Tywin serve as the crown's advisor in the creation of these councils, or would he spurn the king's direct request? Tension coiled in every corner of the room. This was a test. If Tywin accepted, he would once again step into a role that might overshadow the king's authority. If he refused, it could be seen as treasonous. Tywin bowed, asserting that he would be honored to advise in any capacity the king saw fit. Aerys clapped his hands with a brittle joy, proclaiming to the gathered audience that Tywin was once more proving his loyalty, a demonstration that even the mightiest lord must submit to the crown. After this pronouncement, a wave of polite applause spread through the hall, though many faces showed stunned disbelief. Aerys abruptly dismissed them all, bounding down from the Iron Throne and sweeping out of the chamber, leaving the lords and ladies to disperse in his wake. Tywin rejoined Joanna's side, speaking in a low tone. He said that, on the surface, this was a triumph. The king had not only accepted the Western reforms, but intended to replicate them under Tywin's guidance. Still, there was the underlying note of caution, a sense that at any moment, if Tywin's shadow grew too long, Aerys might lash out. In the corridors outside the throne room, a small crowd of nobles gathered around Tywin and Joanna, offering congratulations and asking questions. Some wondered if Tywin would now become the hand of the king again, or if a new title would be fashioned. Others whispered that the king's favor could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Tywin answered politely, but revealed nothing beyond the fact that he would serve as an advisor for this project. Joanna, standing quietly at his side, displayed a calm assurance that lent weight to Tywin's words. Over the next weeks, Tywin and Joanna settled into a routine at court, drafting initial plans for the Crownlands councils. They consulted with local lords and city officials, gathering information on what measures might help quell petty disputes among villages near Blackwater Bay or hamlets further inland. Tywin was thorough, aware that the king would scrutinize every detail, looking for any sign of betrayal or overreach. Joanna continued her subtle influence, forging quiet alliances with ladies of noble families who had grown weary of the king's erratic rule. As the project took shape, courtiers speculated that Tywin's star was rising again, that he would soon hold a position of greater power than any mere lord. But Tywin was cautious, remembering too well how quickly Aerys's admiration could turn to envy, how the king's pride would not tolerate a threat to his supremacy. He took care to keep the king informed of every step, phrasing each proposal as a reflection of the king's vision. He learned to cloak his personal authority in the rhetoric of royal favor. Joanna, meanwhile, noticed changes in the atmosphere of the Red Keep. A few nights, she was awakened by the echo of the king's shouts emanating from distant corridors. Rumors of his outbursts spread through servants like wildfire. Stories of furniture smashed, scribes driven from his presence, a looming sense of doom that clung to the corners of the castle. She worried that if Aerys' madness grew worse, no plan, however well constructed, could prevent a break in the realm's fragile stability. She shared her concerns with Tywin, who acknowledged the danger. He had begun to wonder if the future of the realm might eventually depend on removing Aerys from power. But that was a dire possibility, and not one he would speak of openly. Not yet. For now, the king's unpredictability was still contained within the walls of the Red Keep. In the midst of these tensions, Tywin and Joanna received a letter from Kevin at Casterly Rock. Their presence was requested back in the west at the earliest opportunity. A series of minor disputes had flared up among lesser houses, which threatened to escalate without Tywin's guiding hand. Kevin had managed to quell the initial hostilities, but he warned that old grudges die hard. Tywin and Joanna weighed whether it was safe to leave King's Landing so soon after the king's public endorsement of their reforms. If they departed too abruptly, Aerys might take it as an insult. If they stayed too long, the West might unravel the progress made in their absence. They decided that a strategic request for leave was in order. Tywin approached the king in the throne room, bowing deeply, and explaining the need for his attention in the West, to ensure that the reforms continued without incident. He framed it as a matter of maintaining the very stability that the king had so recently praised. Aerys, seated on the Iron Throne, regarded him with narrowed eyes. Silence stretched, the king's fingers tapping restlessly on the steel edges of his seat. Finally he conceded, though he insisted Tywin return soon to advise on the Crownlands councils. He also demanded that Tywin leave behind a trusted envoy to keep the king informed of further developments. Tywin promised he would, carefully selecting one of his more discreet advisors to remain at the Red Keep. Not long after, the Lannister retinue departed King's Landing, making the journey west again. The road seemed more familiar this time, though the foreboding sense of leaving behind an unpredictable king gnawed at Tywin. Joanna shared his unease, yet they pressed forward with the stoic determination that had carried them this far. At each inn or castle along the way, they heard fresh rumors of the king's rages, of his paranoia over imaginary plots. But they also heard whispers of how the West's reforms had inspired certain lords in the Reach and Riverlands to experiment with local councils of their own. The seeds they planted at Casterly Rock seemed to be germinating, even if in a scattershot way. Arriving home was a mixed relief. Casterly Rock loomed against the western sky, a fortress that had withstood centuries of storms and sieges. Its familiar battlements and towering lion statues offered comfort. Yet waiting within its halls were the petty feuds Kevin had mentioned, along with potential new tensions that might have sprouted while Tywin and Joanna were at court. They wasted little time settling back into the rhythms of rule, summoning local lords, mediating disputes, and reinforcing the message that peace was more profitable than conflict. Tywin learned that two lesser houses, House Lefford and House Brax, had bickered over a patch of land near a stream that fed both their fields. In the old days, such a dispute could escalate into open warfare, with one side raiding the other's crops at night, leaving a trail of bloody reprisals. Now, under the new system, representatives from both houses were to present their cases before a local council, mediated by a neutral scribe, appointed by Tywin himself. Tywin attended one of these sessions, observing how the structure worked in practice. Lords from neighboring houses sat on the council, each with a vested interest in keeping the region peaceful. They listened to evidence, cross-examined stewards, and eventually reached a compromise that allotted water rights fairly. It was not a perfect solution. Each side grumbled that they deserved more. But no swords were drawn, and no blood was spilled. Tywin regarded that as progress. Beyond local disputes, the broader realm's attention turned to how soon Tywin might return to King's Landing. Ravens arrived weekly from the king's envoy, inquiring after the West's readiness to share more insights. Tywin responded promptly each time, careful to maintain the king's good opinion. Yet days slipped into weeks, and the king did not command him back in haste. Instead, new letters came with a more urgent tone, describing the king's renewed suspicions of hidden enemies. Tywin wondered if Aerys had found new courtiers to accuse of treason, or if imaginary threats had seized his mind. Whispers reached him that even the king's own son, Prince Rhaegar, was uneasy about his father's state. Those rumors were less confirmed, but Tywin suspected them to be true. All the while, Joanna worked alongside him, meeting with small folk, hearing petitions in the castle's outer bailey. She found that many peasants were emboldened by the sense that House Lannister now governed with a steadier hand. They came forward to request repairs for a footbridge, or to seek justice for stolen goats. Some of these matters were trifling compared to the lofty politics of King's Landing, but Joanna reminded Tywin that it was in these mundane concerns that the seeds of discontent or loyalty took root. If the small folk felt truly looked after, they had less reason to listen to malcontents preaching rebellion. Tywin listened, seeing the wisdom in her approach, a wisdom he might once have dismissed as too soft. Their work continued for several months, a tense but productive period. Trade flourished, roads remained clear, and local councils resolved disputes without major violence. Yet the specter of King Aerys's madness loomed over them. If the king descended further into paranoia, any moment he might unleash chaos upon the realm. Tywin drafted contingency plans, quietly ensuring that if the worst came to pass, the West would be defended. He had no desire to break the kingdom apart, but he would protect his people, and especially Joanna, from a monarch gone mad. When the summons finally came again, it was briefer than before, almost curt. A letter bearing the royal seal informed Tywin that the king demanded his presence at the next name-day feast in King's Landing, where new edicts would be proclaimed. The letter mentioned nothing of councils or pacification. It simply stated that Tywin's attendance was required, and that those who failed the king risked grave consequences. Tywin felt the chill in those words. He looked at Joanna, whose expression mirrored his concern. The message suggested a shift in the king's mood, perhaps a darker turn. They began preparations anew, gathering a slightly smaller retinue this time. Traveling lightly might help them arrive quickly, reducing any chance for the king to brood on Tywin's tardiness. Kevin assured them he would watch over Casterly Rock and maintain the peace they had built. Tywin and Joanna entrusted many responsibilities to him, quietly reminding him that if word ever arrived of the king's fury turning lethal, Kevin was to fortify the rock immediately. Kevin's eyes were grim, but he nodded in understanding. Once again they embarked for King's Landing, the roads perhaps more familiar now, though no less fraught with uncertainty. The journey took days, and at each night's camp, Tywin lay awake, thinking of all that might transpire once they stood again before the Iron Throne. Joanna, too, found sleep elusive, her mind replaying the ominous note of the king's letter. She asked if Tywin believed Aerys might be summoning him for a final confrontation. Tywin admitted that he did not know. There was a chance the king's mood had simply swung in another direction, or that some new whisper had fueled Aerys' suspicions about the West. The only clear fact was that they had to return. To refuse would be to declare open defiance, and that would unravel everything they had accomplished. For all their carefully laid plans to pacify the realm, they still answered to the crown. When they neared the city once more, the gates opened to admit them, and a contingent of gold-cloaked guards escorted them through the teeming streets. Tywin noticed fewer smiles and more wary looks directed their way. The tension in the capital seemed thicker than before, like a storm gathering over the horizon. At the Red Keep, they were assigned rooms in the royal apartments, which was unusual and spoke to the king's desire to keep them under close watch. The steward who guided them had a pale, nervous countenance, avoiding direct eye contact. Servants approached with downcast gazes, as though afraid to speak too loudly. No immediate audience with the king was granted that day. Instead, a message arrived, instructing Tywin and Joanna to attend the royal name-day feast the following evening in the Great Hall. Until then, they were expected to remain within the Red Keep and await further instructions. Tywin paced in the antechamber of their suite, his mind turning over every possibility. Joanna watched him, her own anxiety evident in the way she clasped her hands. She observed that in the months since they left, the king's paranoia must have grown. The hush of the corridors, the guarded manner of the servants, it all pointed to a court walking on eggshells. The next evening, the name-day celebrations commenced. The great hall was richly decorated, with banners bearing the three-headed dragon in black and red. The air smelled of roast meat, sweet wines, and candle wax. Musicians played lively tunes that did little to dispel the undercurrent of tension. The king made his entrance in a regal cloak embroidered with silver flames, a gold crown on his head. He scanned the crowd as though searching for hidden enemies behind every pillar. Tywin and Joanna, standing among the higher lords, bowed with the rest as the king passed. Aerys took his seat at the head table, beckoning them to come forward. They obeyed, stepping onto the dais to offer formal good wishes for the king's name-day. Aerys' laugh seemed strained as he accepted their words of praise. He raised his cup, toasting the generosity and loyalty of House Lannister. The crowd of courtiers echoed the toast, though some drank apprehensively. As the feast progressed, jugglers and bards performed, but they could not banish the uneasy atmosphere. The king barely touched his food. His eyes swept the hall, lingering on Tywin as if expecting some act of betrayal at any moment. Then, in a theatrical gesture, he demanded the hall's attention. The music ceased, and all eyes turned to the head table. Aerys announced that he would proclaim a series of new edicts, including measures for controlling the flow of trade through the crown lands. He spoke of imposing additional levies on goods traveling to and from the West, explaining that these funds were necessary for the crown's continued prosperity. A hush fell. This was a pointed move. Everyone knew that the West, with its vast resources, relied on trade routes. Increased levies would hamper the very prosperity Tywin had fostered. Some lords exchanged glances. Tywin's face remained impassive, though inwardly he recognized this for what it was, a test or a provocation to see if House Lannister would object. The king went on to say that while councils might be beneficial in certain regions, he retained absolute authority to modify or revoke them at will. He spared Tywin a pointed look, as if to say, "Do you dare protest?" The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Tywin inclined his head, acknowledging the king's prerogative. There was no outburst from him, no dramatic refusal. The king's lips curled in a thin smile, as though both pleased and disappointed by Tywin's composure. The feast continued, though the mood was soured by these pronouncements. Some of the lesser lords fell over themselves praising the king's foresight, trying to curry favor. Others stared at Tywin, wondering if the lion would roar. Tywin maintained a polite demeanor, exchanging only the most necessary words. Joanna observed it all, her heart pounding, worried that the entire piece might unravel with a single misstep. Yet Tywin remained unflinching, refusing to provide Aerys with an excuse for open confrontation. When at last the feast ended, Aerys rose and swept from the hall, his personal guard trailing behind him. The courtiers began to disperse, relief warring with apprehension on their faces. Tywin and Joanna moved quietly through the throng, acknowledging a few acquaintances who ventured a bow or a whispered query about the new levies. Tywin reassured them in vague terms, keeping his true feelings hidden. Back in the seclusion of their royal suite, Tywin removed his cloak and tossed it on a chair with unusual force. Joanna closed the door, stepping closer to him, worry evident in her eyes. He exhaled, his composure cracking momentarily. The king's new levies were not only punitive but a direct challenge to the West's autonomy, an attempt to demonstrate that any wealth generated by Lannister reforms could be siphoned away by royal decree. Worse, it set a precedent that could disrupt the fragile alliances Tywin had forged. If the lesser houses saw their profits diminished under these new fees, they might resent Tywin for not defending them. Yet if Tywin openly confronted the king, it could lead to dire consequences, potentially plunging the realm back into conflict. Joanna laid a hand on his arm, encouraging him to breathe. She reminded him that they had cultivated a network of alliances, not just in the West, but also among certain lords in the Reach, the Riverlands, and possibly even Dorne. The king's madness might lead him to isolate himself if he continued to impose harsh measures. In that case, more houses might rally to Tywin's more moderate approach. The question was whether the realm could afford to wait for Aerys's folly to alienate enough nobles. How much damage might he do in the meantime? Tywin nodded, regaining his calm. He said they would try to negotiate or at least mitigate the harm of these levies in the royal councils. He would approach the Master of Coin, whose office oversaw tax collection, to see if a compromise could be reached. Perhaps they could structure the levies in a way that wouldn't cripple trade. It was a precarious balancing act, but one he was prepared to attempt. Over the next several days, Tywin engaged in a quiet campaign of diplomacy within the Red Keep. He dined with the Master of Coin, plying him with talk of how the West's success ultimately benefited the crown, in a broader sense, as profitable trade meant a larger overall tax base. He hinted that excessive levies would stifle growth, eventually reducing revenue. The Master of Coin, a practical man, seemed receptive, but also wary of the king's wrath. Tywin suggested incremental fees, instead of a sweeping increase, a plan that might win the king's approval without destroying the West's economy. Meanwhile, Joanna worked among the ladies of the court, gleaning what she could of the king's mood and the whispered rumors. She learned that the king had grown fixated on the possibility of Tywin becoming too beloved by the realm, overshadowing the Targaryen dynasty. She also heard that the king might be considering a forced betrothal for one of Tywin's children to a Targaryen cousin, effectively binding House Lannister more tightly to the throne, and thereby keeping Tywin in check. Joanna conveyed these rumors to Tywin, who took them seriously. If the king insisted on such a match, it could reshape the future of the house in unpredictable ways. All the while, the name-day celebrations continued in the city, albeit overshadowed by the king's erratic proclamations. Tourneys took place outside the walls, but their attendance was subdued. People whispered that the king's next order might be a new tax on archery contests, or ban on certain amusements. The unpredictability of the crown dampened any genuine festivity. Tywin refused to show outward frustration, but the situation weighed on him. Peace thrived under rational administration, not the wild swings of a monarch who saw enemies in every shadow. One evening, as Tywin and Joanna prepared to retire, they were startled by a loud rapping on the door of their chamber. A royal guard stood outside, breathless, bearing an urgent summons from the king. Tywin exchanged a glance with Joanna, both of them aware that nighttime calls rarely boded well in Aerys court. Without delay, they followed the guard through the labyrinthine corridors to a small council chamber. There they found Aerys pacing, his hands clenched behind his back, eyes gleaming with agitation. A few of his closest advisors hovered near the walls, looking uneasy. Aerys demanded to know about rumors that certain lords had begun complaining of the new levies. He glared at Tywin, as though accusing him of fomenting discontent. Tywin calmly explained that some lords had expressed concern, but only because the West's trade routes were vital to many families' livelihoods. He reassured the king that he was working with the Master of Coin to refine the policy. Aerys did not seem placated. His voice rose, accusing Tywin of coddling rebellious lords, of seeking to undermine the crown by pretending to be the realm's savior. The king's face shone with sweat, his hair disheveled, giving him a half-mad appearance. Joanna's presence seemed to irritate him further. He cast her a sidelong glare. Tywin stood firm, refusing to take the bait. He reiterated his loyalty, painting a picture of a realm that would benefit from stable taxes, rather than crippling fees. He said the king's greatness would be better served by building alliances than by imposing burdens that bred resentment. Aerys fumed, pacing faster, occasionally gripping a chair as if he might hurl it across the room. One of his advisors attempted to soothe him, but Aerys barked at the man to be silent. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Every breath in the chamber weighted with the possibility of violence. At last, Aerys stopped pacing and fixed Tywin with a baleful stare. He snarled that Tywin could fix the levy plan if he wished, but that any hint of insubordination from the lords of the West would be laid at Tywin's feet. He threatened that if a single whisper of rebellion arose, he would consider it proof that the Lion harbored treasonous ambitions. The ultimatum was clear: hold the West in perfect obedience to the crown's edicts or face the king's wrath. Tywin bowed, as did Joanna, both intoning that they understood the king's will. Aerys dismissed them with a violent wave of his hand, then turned away, muttering incoherently under his breath. Back in their chambers, Tywin paced, silent fury radiating from him. Joanna approached cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder. She said they were walking a fine line. If the king continued on this path, eventually he might attempt something irreversible, either launching an open purge of perceived traitors or taking some measure that forced the West into defiance. Tywin nodded, jaw clenched. He spoke in a low voice, admitting that his patience was wearing thin. He could not allow House Lannister to be dragged down by a mad monarch's self-destructive spiral. Yet, for the moment, they had no choice but to comply. Tywin resolved to ride immediately to his bannermen, insisting they abide by the king's levies, however grudgingly, while he worked with the Master of Coin to make the edicts tolerable. Joanna agreed, though she questioned how long they could sustain this delicate dance. Each day at court was a risk. One ill-timed word, one rumor of disloyalty, and the king could lash out. Possibly, the only way forward would be to unite the great lords in demanding the king step down or accept a regency. But that was a step no one dared to take openly. In the following weeks, Tywin strove to mitigate the damage of the new levies. He walked the corridors of power with measured calm, all the while keeping a vigilant eye on the king's unpredictable moods. Joanna continued to gather information from every corner of the castle, forging quiet alliances with those disturbed by Aerys's behavior. Despite the strain, there were no immediate outbreaks of violence. The West complied with the king's decrees, albeit reluctantly. Trade slowed somewhat, but it did not collapse entirely, thanks to Tywin's negotiations behind the scenes. However, tension thickened with each passing day, as if the realm itself held its breath. Knights in the Red Keep maintained a constant watch for any sign of the king's displeasure. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones about cryptic remarks the king had made at dinner or nightmares he purportedly suffered. Tywin recognized the signs of a gathering storm. He had seen them before, on the eve of conflicts that had ravaged entire houses. He knew that if the king's paranoia continued to grow unchecked, Westeros could plunge into chaos once more. In this fraught atmosphere, Tywin and Joanna found solace in each other's company, though their moments of quiet were increasingly rare. Late at night, they would stand by the narrow windows of their chamber, gazing at the moonlit sprawl of King's Landing. He would wrap an arm around her waist, and she would rest her head on his shoulder. They spoke of the future, of a day when the realm might truly be at peace, when they could return to Casterly Rock with no looming threat from the Iron Throne. But those dreams felt fragile, constantly overshadowed by the reality of Aerys's growing madness. Still, they carried on. Tywin wrote to Kevin, advising him to fortify defenses along the major roads into the west, not as an act of open defiance, but as a precaution should lawlessness surge. Joanna quietly collected small tokens of gratitude from lords who appreciated House Lannister's efforts to moderate the king's impositions. Each token was a thread in a wider web of influence, a reminder that if the king pushed too far, he would not merely face House Lannister. The realm itself might unite against tyranny. Months dragged on, and the king announced another feast, this time to celebrate the progress of the new Crownlands councils that Tywin had originally helped establish. It was a hollow celebration, for the councils had stalled due to the king's erratic decrees. Tywin and Joanna made appearances as required, always mindful of the eyes upon them. The feast was predictably tense. Aerys drank heavily, occasionally erupting in hollow laughter or suspicious glares. Guests exchanged guarded pleasantries, praying for the night to end without incident. That evening, after the feast, Tywin was summoned yet again, this time by a haggard court official who claimed the king wished to see him in private. Joanna waited anxiously in their chambers as Tywin followed the official. He was led to a dimly lit corridor deep within the Red Keep, where a single torch revealed a door guarded by 2 gold cloaks. They stepped aside and Tywin entered. Inside, the king stood alone by a narrow window overlooking the Blackwater. The moonlight etched his figure in pale silver. He did not look at Tywin immediately, but spoke in a low, hollow voice. He asked if Tywin remembered the days when he served as hand, when the realm was orderly and profitable, when the lords feared Tywin's wrath even more than the king's. Tywin said that he remembered, and that he had always acted in service to the crown. Aerys turned then, his face caught in the half-light, revealing eyes rimmed with exhaustion or madness. He remarked that many whispered the realm was more stable in those days than it was now. Tywin carefully replied that each king faced his own challenges, but that he believed in the longevity of Targaryen rule. Aerys let out a brittle laugh, stepping closer. His breath smelled of wine and something acrid, like fear. He spoke of how the lords whispered that Tywin was the true ruler, how they praised him for bringing order while mocking the king for chaos. He accused Tywin of enjoying that praise, of secretly harboring ambitions to overthrow the Targaryens. Tywin kept his voice level, denying any such desire, reiterating his loyalty. The king stared at him, eyes hungry for any sign of deceit. Then, with a jarring abruptness, he seized Tywin's collar, pulling him close so their faces nearly touched. The stench of wine was overpowering. Tywin tensed, half expecting the king to draw a dagger. Aerys whispered that he would not allow the lion to overshadow the dragon. He threatened that if Tywin or any Lannister made a single misstep, the king would light a fire so bright the realm would see its glow from the wall. He would burn every rebel, every insurrectionist, every false friend. Tywin held the king's stare without flinching, though inside his heart pounded. Slowly, Aerys released him, stepping back with a wild grin. The king muttered something about the hour growing late, then waved Tywin away as if he were a bothersome servant. Tywin bowed stiffly and departed, the tension in his chest barely contained. As soon as he returned to his chambers, he bolted the door, recounting the incident to Joanna. They both understood. The king's madness was at the brink. The realm perched on a precipice. One push, one spark, and everything they had built would be consumed in flames. The question now was how to act. Tywin weighed the danger of open confrontation against the danger of doing nothing. He thought of the alliances he had nurtured, the uneasy peace that bound the 7 kingdoms. He remembered the sweet taste of success when local councils resolved disputes without bloodshed, the glimpses of a better future. All of it hung by a thread. Joanna looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fear and resolve he felt. She said quietly that they must do everything in their power to preserve what they had accomplished. But if the king forced their hand, if he endangered the realm itself, then Tywin might have to make the hardest choice of all. Tywin nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. The night sky spread out over King's Landing, silent yet fraught with portent. House Lannister's path had never been so treacherous. And somewhere, beneath the hush of the city, a storm of madness gathered, waiting to break.